Hello. Because of the context we're in and because of my area of interest, I'm going to focus today on talking about equality and diversity in higher education. But much of what I want to talk about is also relevant to how people interact together in other contexts, in other social institutions, work, politics, media, healthcare, peer groups, and also in our interactions generally. I'm a sociologist, so that's what I'm interested in, focusing on and trying to understand what takes place in our social lives as social creatures, how we interact together in social relationships and institutions. I'm particularly interested in the relevance to these interactions of aspects of our identity like gender, social class, access to both economic resources and education, and other things as well, ethnicity, sexuality, age, and whether or not we have a disability, and so on. And I'm also interested in the significance of power in our interactions with one another, and how this playing out of power in our interactions relates to and maps onto these various aspects of our identity, who we are and our experiences. This means that I'm interested in identifying and exploring places in which there appears to be a particular concentration of power, and trying to develop understanding of the complex ways in which this power is mobilised in the way individuals and groups interact with other individuals and groups. This includes, for example, by governments in relation to the public, by religious leaders, by adults including parents and teachers in relation to children and young people, and the power dynamics in relations on a global scale between countries with different access to resources, and within societies, including in interactions between men and women and in terms of sexual orientation and ethnicity. I think power can be seen as being about who has a greater share of resources, whatever they are, that are relevant to informing what happens and what's seen as being important and legitimate in a given social context. So far this is all quite abstract, and I haven't really begun to talk either about equality and diversity or higher education, but I'd like to turn some of these underlying ideas now towards addressing how we think about equality and diversity, and in particular in higher education. I think higher education is a really relevant example to take because it can be seen as a location of concentrated power. Universities produce knowledge, and we now live in knowledge societies in which knowledge is seen to a great extent as having replaced tangible things as the most valuable commodity. Universities generate claims to what's true and important by carrying out research and informing agendas and policy. Universities are worth a lot of money. Students pay a lot of money to come to them. Vice-chancellors earn a lot of money. In fact, many people in higher education either earn relatively a good deal of money, or at least hope to once they complete their studies, compared to a lot of people who don't go to university. That's arguably become the defining reason for being here in what's seen as having become the neoliberal university. And from the perspective of education commentators like the French sociologist Bourdieu, and many others who've worked with and further developed his ideas, higher education can be seen as a process that disproportionately draws in individuals from more socially advantaged positions, whether in terms of wealth, ethnicity, gender, and certifies those groups, those individuals, for successful futures, justifying their privilege by passing it off as a result of personal skill and hard work rather than the fruits of inequality. This slide shows the exclusive Bullingdon Club at Oxford University, and at the same time members there both are current Mayor of London Boris Johnson and current Prime Minister David Cameron. Throughout history, many people have accepted and justified social inequalities in access to resources, including power, wealth, education, as being just and fair, as being the fruits of hard work and ability. People have known their place, assuming these inequalities to be the rightful order of things, rather than something to be challenged, as the two Ronnies have told us.
I look down on him because I am upper class.
I look up to him because he is upper class. But I look down on him because he is lower class. I am middle class.
Okay. And there remains plenty of justification to be heard that access to social resources operates fairly and that there are adequate opportunities for those who work hard and are deserving, as this quote shows from a Boris Johnson speech. But not everyone believes that access to enjoying resources and privilege is that simple. And what's more, many people say that see the way power and opportunities do operate as being unfair, and that we therefore have a social responsibility to address such inequalities where they're identified. To give some key developments in UK law in the addressing of social inequalities, the Equal Pay Act came into place in 1970, dictating that men and women should earn the same pay for doing the same work, although the persisting gender pay differential is argued to mean that women effectively still work for the months of November and December unpaid. The Sex Discrimination Act became law in 1975, and the Disability Discrimination Act in 1995. And in 2010, the Equality Act, which brought into play protection for 9 protected characteristics all under one law. In terms of higher education specifically, since 2001, the Equality Challenge Unit has worked to promote equality in universities, specifically for staff and students. And the widening participation agenda has over several decades worked to support opportunities for diverse students from different backgrounds in higher education. If we continue with this example of widening participation in higher education to include more students from non-traditional backgrounds, much work has focused on the idea of raising aspirations amongst students from less traditional backgrounds. The idea being that people need encouraging to embrace the opportunities that higher education offers them. As a sociologist interested in the kinds of power relations I've talked about and how these operate to the detriment of less advantaged groups and individuals, I want to problematise that kind of approach. That focuses on what some individuals might be doing wrong and therefore just need to try a bit harder to embrace the opportunities that are there. Problematising representation of different groups of people in higher education as a failure of some people to knock hard enough on the door perhaps, rather than the failure of institutions to open that door. I'm not doing justice here to the complexity of the issues. So, for example, university students from black and minority ethnic backgrounds have been identified by some research as being less likely to apply for the most elite universities when applying for university. But rather than thinking this means it's as simple as encouraging those individuals to apply for elite universities, I think what we need to do is problematise what kinds of messages those elite universities must be transmitting about the kinds of students that would belong at an institution like theirs, and problematise them. This idea of attributing responsibility to institutions for making sure they support participation by diverse individuals isn't new and isn't restricted to higher education. It's also relevant to other social institutions, and it has a lot of basis in the social model of disability as developed most prominently by the academic and disability rights activist Mike Oliver. The idea is that rather than locating problems in individuals who are seen as, because of their own characteristics, being excluded from participating in social institutions so that they need to be helped to be able to participate, that what we need to do instead is think what's wrong about institutions that diverse individuals aren't able to participate equally in them. What needs to change about the institutions rather than the individuals? In terms of higher education, part of this discussion is couched in terms including around the idea of developing an inclusive curriculum, including content that acknowledges and validates diverse perspectives, including in terms of gender, ethnicity and internationalism. It also means setting up assessments with alternative modes of assessment in place for students who have problems with particular assessment modes. And validating diversity through providing the option of gender-neutral toilets and gender-neutral pronouns and titles. This university is among those that has developed provision of gender-neutral toilets. And this quote from The Spectator magazine indicates how not everybody sees the value in creating such inclusive spaces within institutions. So far, I've parked responsibility for supporting participation by diverse students firmly at the door of institutions. But what I want to do now is actually contradict myself a bit. When I began to talk about power, I identified that even though there were concentrations in powerful institutions, that power is also present in all of our interactions. What complicates this further is that it's not as simple as each of us having a static power positioning, and this instead changes in relation to the many interactions we carry out with different individuals. And understanding these complex dynamics has much to thank theories of intersectionality as developed from black feminism, and particularly the ideas of Kimberly Crenshaw. So intersectionality identifies that it can't be seen as only one, or even predominantly any one defining facet of our identity, whether that's gender, ethnicity, or something else that informs our experience in any social context, but rather the cumulative force of these key aspects of our identity, which together come together to be more than the sum of their individual parts. What's more, the relative significance of these different facets of our identity is also shifting rather than static, so that what are the defining aspects varies according to the characteristics and prejudices of whoever we might be interacting with. Foucault, another important French theorist, extensively theorised power and the way in which powerful social institutions exercise power over the bodies and minds of people. But Foucault also famously theorised that while there are undoubtedly concentrations of power, these aren't the exclusive domains of power, but rather that power is everywhere. So because of this rather slippery and ubiquitous nature of power, all of us have responsibility to think about our behaviour and attitudes in interaction with others, whatever our roles. There's been increasing discussion recently of unconscious bias or implicit bias, which comes out of the field of psychology. And the two are related but distinct concepts. I'm going to stick with the language of unconscious bias because it's the language that's been predominantly taken up in UK higher education. The idea is that all of us are seen as holding or operating biases towards and against other people according to groups we see them as representing. And what's more, it's argued that while we might consciously support equality and diversity, this doesn't prevent unconscious biased responses in much the same way that knowing this is a static image doesn't prevent our minds from seeing it as moving. Universities are developing awareness around how unconscious bias operates alongside conscious bias. And rightly, I think much of this focus is targeted towards individuals with the most powerful decision-making responsibilities for selection of staff and for selection of students and recruitment and promotion of staff. But I don't think this is where it ends, because I've also identified how I think power can be seen as permeating all of our interactions. The power dynamic, for example, between a university student and their lecturer is therefore constituted of facets that might include gender, sexuality, ethnicity, class, disability, and the complex intersections between these. Even staff who aren't in senior roles responsible for hiring and firing decisions nevertheless hold considerable power over the opportunities of their colleagues and students. We carry out peer evaluations of each other's teaching, of colleagues' teaching and research. We have responsibility for marking students' work, writing references, and on a daily basis making decisions about who we invite to make contributions to seminar discussion and how we respond to these as being worthy or not worthy. But there's still more beyond this that's needed. The complex operationalising of power within social interactions according to intersecting facets of identity means that, as I've identified, that it's not just staff at universities or any social institution who automatically hold power over their clients, in the case of university students. Rather, this is mediated by other aspects of identity. Equality and diversity isn't just something that powerful institutions are responsible for, while individuals can sit back and be the passive recipients of this. This means that students also hold responsibility for interrogating their own unconscious biases. Students' biases affect both their fellow students and their teachers. Research has identified, for example, that students can show a preference to work with home rather than international students when asked to organise themselves into groups for seminar discussion. In a neoliberal higher education marketplace where students actively choose universities, students' unconscious biases also invert assumed power relations to impact their teachers. A study from North Carolina University shows how students rate their university teachers differently according to gender. And in fact, anyone can see this by exploring the words used to describe university teachers on the US-based Rate My Professor's website. Women academics are more commonly described as both helpful and unhelpful compared to men, implying that they should be helpful, while men are more likely to be described using words like brilliant and genius. These graphs show how female lecturers across disciplines are more likely to be described both by their students as being both nice and incompetent. So to conclude, all of us, whatever our personal characteristics and whether university student or staff, operate biases towards others we encounter in higher education and elsewhere, whether or not we're aware of these. So where does this leave us? What should we do? I'd suggest that the starting point is to acknowledge this and to be aware of it in our interactions. We might not be able to fully prevent ourselves from experiencing biases, but we can certainly do our best to be conscious of how these work and accordingly deliberate in our actions in terms of behaving towards others how we'd like to be treated. It's important to hold the powerful to account, but also to recognise when that powerful is us and to hold ourselves to account.